Hey everyone, welcome back to another hardware news recap for the week. In this one we have a GN exclusive item on the actual chipset cost for the chipsets that go into motherboards, which obviously contributes to the higher or lower motherboard prices that you see. We'll also be talking about AGESA naming nomenclature that appears to be changing from AMD's side, talking about a definitely legitimate Nintendo-inspired product as well called the Powkitty X2, I think is the name, ASUS and its new APE solution, which is a BFB equivalent, and then Intel improving stock coolers, among a few other things. Before that, this video is brought to you by MSI and the Z490 Unify ITX motherboard for Intel 10 series CPUs. The MSI Z490 Unify ITX board benefits from a memory layout that makes memory overclocking easy, positioning the board well for enthusiasts who want to tinker on a bench or in an ITX system. The MSI Z490 Unify runs 90 amp power stages, a 10-layer PCB, and seats the memory as close to the socket as possible, all of which benefit the overclocking experience. Learn more at the link in the description below. The first news item for the week then will be the chipset cost to the motherboard manufacturers, the board partners, or AIBs as many people call them. So AIB partners obviously buy the chipset from Intel or AMD. They are one of Intel and AMD's largest customers out of their entire customer base. And that's because they need to buy something to put on the motherboards. So the price of those is variable depending on which chipset you're talking about. But we recently started looking into chipset cost to manufacturers, which gets passed on to customers with some kind of multiplier on it because that's how business works. That's fair and how the game is played. But we were curious about it. And it sounds like, from what we understand today, in speaking with motherboard partners, the Z490 chipset cost, despite not having the complexity of PCIe Gen 4, is actually almost the same price as the X570 chipset. Both, as we understand it, are approaching $50 for cost to the board partners. That's one of the items on the BOM and on the bill of materials. And it's higher than Z390 was. So Z490's increased in price, but doesn't really add a whole lot of features. And that's the interesting part, because Z490 versus 390, the primary differentiating factor is the addition of some Wi-Fi capabilities on Z490. Otherwise, they are almost identical in every other way. X570, meanwhile, we don't have B550's cost yet, but we'll work on that. X570 is about the same, so it's near the $50 mark. And from what we understand, that's a good bit more expensive than what B450 was. But as for exact details, we can't provide that right now. We've got some numbers and have a good idea, but don't really want to rush to publishing without verifying that particular B450 pricing number with a couple other people first. But the Z490 and X570 cost is the one that we verified with a few people, so we're comfortable sharing that number. And it doesn't really do anything for you, it just gives you some perspective as to what you're paying for and why Z490 and X570 boards have a price floor that's higher than previous price floors. The chipset is a significant portion of the cost in addition to the other costs that are incurred when building a motherboard. Next up, AGESA and the naming nomenclature. So AGESA is distilled down into AMD's generic, check my notes, encapsulated system architecture. So you've got AMD within another initialism. It seems to be getting somewhat of a confusing revision, but that might be related to the upcoming changes for Zen 3 support on 400 series motherboards. We're not 100% sure yet. Right now, the upcoming version, according to Hardware Lux and Tom's Hardware, appears to be adding a V2 revision number and will be changing from combo AM4 1.005 on at least the latest version that's out there now for AGESA into a combo AM4 V2 1.0000. So it's presently unclear as to why exactly this is. Hardware Lux reports that even the new AGESA version has fractured, with MSI using combo AM4 V2 10000 on certain AM4 B550 boards, and Gigabyte allegedly using combo AM4 V2 1001. As to what potential changes warrant such additional versioning changes remains to be seen, but if we had to guess, it'd probably be related to the Zen 3 stuff that's going on, because that is going to be a fracture in support, so that would kind of make sense. Next up, Linus Torvalds moving to AMD. It's not that Linus, the other one, the other computing Linus. I actually don't know whose name comes up first if you type Linus into Google anymore, but it's probably one of those two will be up there along with the Peanuts character. So one of the more interesting stories this week is from Linus Torvalds, the creator of both Linux and Git, and the almighty gatekeeper of the Linux kernel. In the latest announcement regarding Linux 5.7 RC7, Torvalds outed that the most exciting thing that had happened to him recently was moving to an AMD-based machine. Quote, "In fact, the biggest excitement for me this week was that I just upgraded my main machine. And for the first time in about 15 years, my desktop isn't Intel-based. No, I didn't switch to ARM yet, but I'm now rocking an AMD Threadripper 3970X. My all-mod config test builds are now 3 times faster than they used to be, which doesn't matter so much right now during the calming down period, but I will most certainly notice the upgrade during the next merge window." Torvalds, who is one of the most vocal people in the industry, cue the clip of his thoughts on NVIDIA.
And NVIDIA has been the single worst company we've ever dealt with. So NVIDIA, fuck you.
Didn't have much to say, though, about the rest of his build. He also didn't tell us much about his previous one. But it's apparent that AMD's Threadripper line is popular among Linux kernel developers. In the limited testing we've done of things like code compile in a Windows environment, even there it's the chart leader, at least for our Chromium compile using Ninja and Klein CL. Additionally, recently, Wendell from Level 1 Techs, who built our server, put together a machine for Greg Hartman, another prominent Linux kernel developer, and that particular build is also using an AMD Threadripper CPU, and that'd be the 3970X. You can check that video out on their channel if you want to learn more about it and hear why they made those choices. Next up, new ARM IP and the Cortex and Mali updates that are coming out. ARM recently announced its yearly updates to its Cortex and Mali IPs at its ARM Tech Day 2020, announcing the new Cortex A78 and Cortex X1 CPU designs. That also included news on the Mali G78 GPU. The new Cortex A78 builds on the previous A77 and 76 designs with a continued focus on efficiency, with the more or less expected iterative or generational performance gains brought by architectural tweaks and a new process node. The Cortex A77 is built on 7 nanometers, whereas the Cortex A78 will be built on 5 nanometers. The A78 is expected to deliver a 20% sustained performance boost compared to the A77, while allegedly operating within the same thermal envelope, which is an important caveat for mobile, as there's only so many ways a smartphone can reasonably dissipate heat. And no, water cooling isn't one of them, but it should be. The Cortex A78 also promises a 50% improvement in energy efficiency over 2019 devices using A77-based SoCs, while maintaining the same performance. ARM also unveiled a new architecture in the form of the Cortex X1, which is less focused on balancing PPA, or performance, power, and area, and more focused on raw performance. This should allow customers to design higher power, higher wattage solutions, which will also no doubt cost more than ARM's traditional IP. On the surface, this seems like ARM is finally trying to close the gap between its designs and Apple's. Love or hate Apple, its core designs and SoCs, particularly the A series, have absolutely led the market for years. ARM also took the wraps off its Mali G78 new GPU, the successor to the Valhalla-based Mali G77. The Mali G78 will be the second GPU derived from ARM's Valhalla architecture and should bring a 25% increase in performance. The Mali G78 stands to offer a 15% performance density improvement, as well as scaling up to 24 cores, where the previous Mali G77 topped out at 16. The Mali G78 also gains a 10% energy efficiency boost based on the claims, which seems somewhat paltry generation over generation, but is still a noteworthy improvement. As we cast this next story, the maws of Nintendo's lawyers are salivating at the idea of such easy prey. It's been hours since they've fed, days, maybe even weeks since the last feeding. That is, if they can get through the usual litigation firewall that's presented for companies based in China. The corpses of various ROM websites do little to sate the appetites of Nintendo's lawyers, and having had their way with Soulja Boy and his latest work, it looks like now Nintendo has potentially another item to keep its eye on, and that's going to be the Powkiddy X2. Gluttonous, ravenous, and desperate, Nintendo's lawyers stand ready to pounce at the most brazen thing to pop up in recent history. And that Powkiddy X2 is probably the one they're looking at. It's a flippant, unapologetic Switch copycat. The Powkiddy X2 is an ARM-based look-alike that seemingly exists to dupe less savvy buyers, especially in the wake of manufacturing and supply chain issues affecting the actual Nintendo Switch and its availability. You might call this one confusingly similar if you were a lawyer, if not just straight up infringing. The Powkiddy X2 uses an ARM A7 quad-core CPU or ARM v7A, a 7-inch IPS display with a resolution of 1024 by 600, which is a bit lower than the Switch's 1280 by 720, and a 3000 milliamp hour battery. Again, this spec fails to meet the Switch's 4310 milliamp hour battery, but they're also much different devices. A few interesting items of note from the marketing and the language around the Powkiddy X2. Quote, "Can 3 people play together?" It's no mark of punctuation, it's just seemingly a statement. Can 3 people play together? The advertisement for the console asks. We don't know. Powkiddy, you tell us. The AliExpress listing promises that we can, quote, "enjoy a big screen of pleasure with the X2 and external double handles." We might get demonetized for that kind of language on YouTube when it scans the transcript. With the Powkiddy X2, there's no removable controllers, so no Joy-Cons as they exist commonly, and there's no dock. In lieu of Joy-Cons, though, users are allowed to use, or rather forced to use, the rare PlayStation controllers, the real ones that had X, Y, A, and B buttons on them. You all know them. Lots of boxes being checked here, and hook those up to the bottom of the device. Here's some marketing material summing up what the experience is ostensibly like. We'll scroll through some of it while we go through the rest of the story. Of course, the Powkiddy X2 doesn't even play Switch games. Rather, it features emulators of older systems, such as the NES, the Game Boy, the SNES, the Famicom, and more. The device costs $80 and can be had over at AliExpress. Litigation seems maybe unlikely for this one, given that it is being sold on AliExpress, but poor Soulja Boy has stories to tell about similar types of products. ASUS APE, besides needing to work on its acronyms and initialisms, the new APE solution by ASUS is a BFB counterpart to what ASRock worked on in last week's news story. So ASUS seems to have joined ASRock in the list of motherboard manufacturers going rogue and technically doing things that Intel probably doesn't like, but Intel likely won't stop them because they need the help right now. And it's going rogue by kind of enabling overclocking on otherwise prohibited platforms. It's not really overclocking per se, it's more of B-clock tuning that would otherwise be forbidden on non-K SKUs and non-Z motherboards. That aside, it appears that ASUS's APE works in a similar fashion to BFB, which again we talked about last week. In ASRock's implementation, ASRock is allowing that the users can lock in a higher PL1 value. And that's specifically the one that would be going from, say, 70 watts up to 125 instead. ASUS is doing largely the same thing, just with a worse name and fewer boards as of right now, but support for both of these features is nebulous in the future. Both companies have a feature that's technically outside of what Intel intends to be allowed on the boards, and ASRock has a disclaimer on its site saying that this feature might not be supported in future BIOS revisions, and that would be if Intel issues an update to its core BIOS that locks out the feature. And this is something that both AMD and Intel do. Motherboard manufacturers find ways around stuff. They don't really get punished for it because it's not technically breaking the rules in the truest sense, but it's breaking the spirit of the rules, and so the loopholes get closed, but no one really gets punished for it. ASRock is, to its credit, along with BioStar, among the most enterprising companies for coming up with workarounds for Intel's blocks. So ASUS enables APE on select 400 series boards. ASRock's got it on select 400 and 300 series boards, and you can check their supported board list if you're curious for more for something like, say, a 10400. And finally, new Intel stock coolers. It seems Intel has finally decided to make some much needed changes to its stock coolers that are included in the box with some processors, and these are for non-K parts. Now, typically, we recommend a cooler purchase with nearly any type of higher end, as in DIY enthusiast class CPU. So we start recommending them at about the R5 3600 and up, or the i5 series and up, because AMD stock coolers, Intel stock coolers really aren't that great, and you can benefit a lot in terms of reduced noise or reduced thermals by getting a different cooler. Either way, though, Intel's finally making some changes. Intel for sure is the company that has needed it the most. We've shown AMD's manufacturing line in the past for its coolers, and actually, if we put that up on the screen, you'll see that the same line that AMD's coolers are coming down in our footage, that's the line that Intel uses as well. Both AMD and Intel have their coolers made by Cooler Master, which is the OEM for their solutions. It's not always branded, but sometimes you can take the cooler apart and find a small logo somewhere in there. So both companies use the same supplier for their solutions. Intel's changes and the overhaul for the stock coolers do pale in comparison to what AMD has overhauled for its coolers in the past, but the changes are nonetheless welcome. According to Tweaktown for this one, Intel has silently updated its boxed coolers with a copper core. It's also been changed to an 80-watt TDP rating for the number that's on the box. There's a new blacked out housing as well, which is the part that Tweaktown specifically was tweeting about. And Tom's Hardware also spoke with Intel about this, and Intel confirmed that the following SKUs will come with the updated cooler. They're listed as the i9-10900 non-K non-F, the i9-10900F non-K. Are these names confusing yet? The i7-10700, the i7-10700F, the W1290, the W1270, the W1250, and that'll be it for now. The 80-watt TDP is an increase over the previous 65-watt TDP specification, which it's kind of, they all measure it different ways, so it's kind of a made-up number, but you get, as long as they're tested the same way, it's still scaling. It seems to address the new Xeon W1200 CPUs specifically for this change, but it has come to consumer parts as well. Additionally, Intel has returned to using copper cores for the new coolers. We have some of these that we could potentially show. The copper core is a slug that was in Intel's older coolers that had been removed in recent years, particularly around Skylake sometime, and replaced instead with just a simple aluminum core. Intel has insisted on shipping coolers with aluminum cores since then, but that's changing. Even though the new coolers are only shipping with newer LGA 1200 CPUs, they are, of course, still compatible with LGA 115X socketable CPUs because the mounting mechanism has not changed. So if you wanted to pick one up for probably 10 or 20 bucks on eBay, which 20 is still a ripoff, but they typically start popping up on eBay if you want a cheap upgrade, if you've got a business system or something with an Intel stock cooler in it. But honestly, you should just buy a better cooler at that point, if it can fit. There's one more news item we got at the very end of the week, and what was probably an inevitable development. Western Digital has become the target of a class action lawsuit over the way the company has handled SMR hard drives, something we've been covering for a couple of weeks now in the hardware news recaps. Western Digital is far from alone here. All of the hard drive makers have engaged in similar practices, and we'll recap those events if you've missed the previous 3 consecutive weeks that we've been covering this. So it started with users on Reddit actually noticing that certain Western Digital RAID models for NASes were performing poorly, not behaving correctly in certain RAID configurations, or couldn't be configured properly in ZFS arrays. It was later discovered that these Western Digital RAIDs were using SMR rather than CMR, and Western Digital wasn't being exactly forthright about it in its marketing materials or spec sheets. No sooner than that news broke, Chris Meller with Block and Files was able to confirm that certain drives from both Seagate and Toshiba also used SMR. And again, neither company was disclosing this information to its customers. The impact is mostly to how things configure and especially write speed, something that we've talked about in the previous episodes. Seagate, for its part, maintained that it was not shipping any NAS drive that used SMR, and it seemed that the nebulous practice of obscuring SMR was limited to client desktop drives. Toshiba's story was more or less the same. Over the next couple weeks, after unwavering criticism from both press and customers, all 3 component companies came forward, so to speak, about using SMR. While Western Digital seems to be the most earnest about being more transparent, it promised updates for product documentation and benchmarks, and Seagate and Toshiba didn't go this far. All 3 hard drive makers officially disclosed every drive that uses SMR. Fast forward to now, and it seems the story isn't over yet. Western Digital is now going to have to contend with litigation of the practice. As to why the lawsuit is only targeting WD, that's because WD was the only one to hide SMR in its NAS product stack. Seagate and Toshiba have not yet shipped a NAS-targeted drive that doesn't use CMR. So they seem to have dodged this bullet, at least for now, until someone files a complaint, which obviously can always happen, whether or not it's valid. There's also the point that Western Digital seemed to explicitly deny using SMR in its WD red line initially, which isn't going to help their case. Haddis Law is heading up the lawsuit, stating that, quote, Western Digital secretly switched many of its hard drives, including its WD red NAS drives, to inferior shingled magnetic recording technology. This deceived and harmed customers, Haddis Law says. Interestingly, Haddis Law points to users having problems with WD Reds as early as March 2019 due to SMR, which, again, isn't a good look. Haddis Law is currently looking for affected customers to join the class action lawsuit. If that wasn't enough, there's also a separate class action lawsuit unfolding in Canada against WD for its use of SMR. That suit alleges that WD misled customers and violated several of Canada's consumer protection laws. The lawsuit is being handled by Top Class Actions and is looking for an injunction against WD, as well as collecting damages on behalf of the plaintiffs. And that'll be it for news this week. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, and we'll see you all next time.